Let's start. We are going to talk about the maxillary and mandibular permanent molars today. So what we'll do is we'll do the maxillary molars first. We'll take a little break and then we'll do the mandibular molars. These are more teeth than what we've ever had to do before because you've got 3 molars on the maxillary and 3 molars on the mandibular that you have to learn about. So unlike incisors where you had 4 incisors, top and bottom, two canines, you know, it's that type of thing, but these have a lot more anatomy in them. So we need to know, is this a first molar, second molar, or a third molar? So let's take a look at this picture, and it says it's the maxillary right first molar, and it's a permanent maxillary right first molar, and the buccal view. Why do you know that this is a maxillary molar?
Oh, it has 3 roots.
3 roots.
3 roots. All right. Yes. Unless it's an anomaly, 3 roots, I know it's a top tooth. All right. And what do you know about first versus second versus third? What are you looking at for other things? Do you think this is a first molar, second molar, or third molar? If you don't know anything, if you didn't have the label.
I think this would be first because, or maybe first or second because the root is kind of spread out.
Exactly. Okay, Jonathan remembers that hint. Yes, the roots are spread out. So you've got very wide spread roots. They're spread the widest in the first molar. Then the second molar is a little bit closer together. And then the third molar is oftentimes fused. Okay, and we can't really see that this is the first molar because if we look at the lingual, we'll be able to see a cusp of Carabelli. So, but this is a nice triangle going on here with this center, this lingual or palatal root being straight up and down. And it's going to be straight up and down for the first molar, and it's not going to be for the second molar. Now, which is the mesial and which is the distal on this tooth? What do you know about first versus second versus third to make this a first or second molar or a third molar?
The mesial is the root on the right.
The mesial root is generally longer and larger. The mesial cusp is generally larger than the distal cusp. So I would say this is the mesial buccal. Okay, so these are things that you already know because of the beginning of the book. If we draw the line straight across, and I'm really lousy at drawing, all right, the mesial CEJ dips a little bit lower, has more of a curvature than the mesial CEJ, than the distal CEJ. I'm sorry, the mesial curves more than the distal. Okay. So let's take a look at traits that differentiate the maxillary second from the maxillary first. You're going to be faced with possibly an extracted tooth that you're looking at a table. And you're going to be expected to identify, is it the first molar or second molar? Is it the right or the left of each? So what can we see on this top picture for the buccal view comparing the first molar to the second molar?
Second molar roots are narrower.
The roots are narrower. And look at this root, the palatal root. The palatal root on the first molar is nice and centered, straight up and down. The palatal root on the second molar tilts just a little bit towards the left. Can you see that?
When you say close to the left, is that distally?
Or towards the distal.
And is that always?
Yes. It's not centered. All right, so when you're drawing your pictures, This is a really good picture of the buccal of a second and a really nice picture of the buccal of the third as far as the roots go. And we also know that the first molar, maxillary first permanent molar, has this fifth tubercle or cusp of Carabelli that the second molar does not have. And then we'll get into the other differentiations. Okay, first versus second. So we've got the first molar here and the second molar is on the right. Take a look also, you can see what we've already discussed. You've got your nice tripod for your first molar, your second molar, that palatal root goes towards the distal just a little bit. And look at the difference in the cusps themselves. The cusps on the first molar are fairly equal, just a little bit bigger for the mesial, but that distal buccal cusp is very large versus look how small it is compared to the second molar. That second molar is not nice and symmetrical. The maxillary first molar is the largest maxillary tooth, largest. Okay, remember also it's going to be the largest molar. The first of any class type is usually the largest. So a class type are going to be your molars. So take a look, you can see also the CEJ. Okay, this is not really representative because it looks like the CEJ dips down on the distal and it shouldn't. But again, the second molar, that root, the palatal root is angled towards the distal and you have that buccal groove not centered. Look also at the difference of the root trunk. J. Which has a shorter root trunk, the first or second?
First.
Second.
First molar. So when you are probing, okay, and you're feeling with your probe, you're probing, and then you get a little dip here, the first molar is going to run into furcation involvement earlier with bone loss than the second molar, because the second molar isn't going to be furcation until here. And the first molar is much more cervical. General characteristics. So there's two prominent cusps on the buccal view for the maxillary molars. The mesiobuccal is generally wider and longer than the distobuccal. That is a general characteristic. The longest mesiolingual cusp tip may also be shown in the buccal view. So the mesial is longer than the distal. This is that mesiobuccal cusp tip. You can see it from the buccal view. Mesiolingual cusp tip. The buccal groove separates the mesiobuccal and the distobuccal cusps, and it's not usually a cavity-prone area. So we've got our first and second molars, okay, and you've got a buccal groove that separates. That's not usually caries prone. And that's going to be different when we talk about the mandibular molars. They all have a mesial contact at the junction of the occlusal and middle thirds. Remember when we divide the tooth up into thirds? The distal contact is more cervical. and near the middle of the tooth. So we've got the distal contact is more cervical than the mesial contact. The distal contact is more cervical than the mesial contact. That's a general characteristic. From the lingual or palatal root is the longest of the three, and it shows behind the mesiobuccal and the distobuccal roots. That distobuccal root is the shortest. So if you've got a mesial and a distal root, the mesial is going to be bigger. That's a general characteristic. So out of the three roots, the distobuccal is the shortest. The mesiobuccal is longer and wider than the distobuccal. The trunk on the first molar is shorter than the trunk on the second, and the roots diverge more on the first than they do on the second. And that's what Jonathan brought up. The roots are really spread apart on the first molar. Second molar is a little closer together. Third molar is often fused. We're turning the teeth around to the lingual. So we're looking at the palatal root. Again, what do we know about the palatal root? On the first molar, that palatal root is straight up and down. Okay, it's fairly straight up and down. You've got a nice cusp of Carabelli here, and you can see the mesial and distal root. On the second molar, it's not quite so straight up and down. It's tilted towards the distal a little bit, and there's no cusp of Carabelli, and that distal is just a little bit different, smaller, versus it's nice and in the middle of the tooth, the mesial and the distal groove on the first molar. There's little or no proximal surface that shows on the lingual view because it's wider on the lingual surface, okay, than and larger with the distal lingual cusp on the first molar. Now we're comparing it to the second molar. The distal lingual cusp on the first molar is larger and wider than it is on the second molar. And there's more proximal that shows, more in between the teeth that shows on the second molar because it's got a smaller distal lingual cusp. It's narrower on the lingual. Between the cusp of Carabelli and the teeth being very square, on the first molar, you're not going to be seeing as much of the proximal surface. First molars have the largest and longest mesiolingual cusp, often with that cusp of Carabelli or a groove, and a somewhat smaller distal lingual cusp. The second molar has the longest mesiolingual cusp and a much smaller distal lingual cusp, or sometimes even missing. So the distal lingual cusp is this: second molar, first molar. The lingual groove is caries prone. This is a test question, always. The buccal groove on maxillary molars are not caries prone. It's the lingual groove that's caries prone. So when you're evaluating teeth for preventive sealants or checking for decay, that's where you want to zero in on. The longest lingual root often has a longitudinal depression on the lingual surface.
Miss D, I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you tell me again about the, lingual groove and pus caries prone on which one? On first or the second?
Both. On maxillary molars, the lingual groove is more caries prone than the buccal.
I was just because of like brushing, right? More people it's easier to brush on the front side, on the buccal side than on the lingual side for people.
Probably.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but you know, and it's also the anatomy of the tooth. It's a deeper groove. And when we talk about the mandibular molars, it's going to be the reverse. The mandibular molars is more caries prone on the buccal than it is on the lingual. That's why I'm emphasizing this.
Okay. Thank you.
So the distal buccal is larger on the first molar than it is the cusp, than it is on the second molar. When we're talking about the roots, the distal buccal and the mesiobuccal roots are closer together when compared to the first molar. So you can tell that this is the distal because the mesial is longer. This is the distal because the mesial is longer, right? The mesial is always longer. These are not great pictures, but when we turn the tooth to look at a proximal view, we've got the first molar versus the second molar. All right, you can't really see a whole big difference here. This is that cusp of Carabelli. The occlusal cervical dimension is less than the facial lingual. Okay, that's just the occlusal cervical dimension is less than the facial lingual. So what they're doing is talking about this versus this. There's only two cusps and a cusp of Carabelli that's mesial, that's visible from the mesial surface since the distal cusps are shorter. Okay, again, the mesial cusps are longer than the distal cusps. Four cusps are visible from the distal since the mesial cusps are shorter than the distal. So all this is showing you is that the mesial is longer than the distal. And that is a general characteristic. The mesial is usually longer than the distal. Maxillary molars from the proximal view, but the book is showing you the mandibular molars. Okay, so the buccal height is in the cervical third, like it is in all teeth. Buccal, well, that's not really very good. Buccal height, the lingual is in the middle third. Oh, I missed that. This is the buccal. And this is the lingual, because this is the cervical third. Those are your contact, okay, heights of contour. You've got a cusp of Carabelli on the first molar that you don't have on the second and third maxillary molar. So if I'm going to ask you to identify a tooth, my friends, it's going to have the general characteristics of what a first molar is. It's going to have three roots and it's going to have a cusp of Carabelli. This is a large cusp of Carabelli. So when you're looking at sealants and decay, oftentimes there can be a cavity in here. So when you're doing sealants and they've got this large cusp of Carabelli, you're flowing some of that sealant in. So this is the distal. This is the mesial, because the mesial is longer than the distal. From the distal view, some of the facial and lingual surfaces may be visible because of the tapering. So this is the distal, but this is the labial or the buccal surface here, because the distal is narrower than the mesial. The mesial marginal ridge is more occlusal than the distal. So more of the occlusal surface is visible from the distal. So again, we are looking at, this is the distal. It's more occlusal than the mesial. It's shorter. The distal is shorter. Tubercles are more common on the mesial marginal ridge than on the distal. Look how wrinkly this mesial marginal ridge is. Those are tubercles. And the ridge, this is that mesial marginal ridge. Now, I'm going to show you this first premolar versus second premolar. The first premolar, this is that marginal ridge, that first premolar has a marginal groove going over the mesial marginal ridge. And that's what that's showing right here, that second premolar doesn't have. The CEJ is nearly flat because the tooth is broad. There's less CEJ curvature on the distal than it is on the mesial, but you really can't see it because it's a nice straight CEJ. Look at the difference in the size also of this root. Okay, the first molar is bigger. Only 2 roots are visible from the mesial. The lingual root is the longest, and it looks like a banana. The palatal root. There's less spread of the maxillary roots on the second molar than it is on the first. The distal root trunk near the CEJ on the maxillary first molar is near the crown and may be concave. That's just extra information. The mesial buccal root has a mesial and distal depression. The distobuccal root is variable. So one of our general characteristics at the beginning when we were talking about root surfaces is that if there's a depression in a root, it's generally on the distal root. This is one of those exception to the rules where the mesiobuccal root has a mesial and distal depression. And this is showing you the depression. So if you were shading, you would be spending your time making that all nice and pretty, or you can just draw a little line there saying that that's a root depression. I'm good with either. What do we know about the occlusals from the first of a class type and a second of a class type? Which is going to have more anatomy, definite anatomy, the first or the second?
First.
The first has the deepest grooves. You're right. Okay, so the first is going to have more anatomy. And take a look at the picture here, which has deeper grooves. It's the first. And it actually has some pits. So when you're doing a sealant, okay, you're not only sealing all of these grooves, but you're doing that distal lingual groove and going over to the distal, and you're checking that cusp of Carabelli. So this is a first molar. Okay, we've got cusp here, cusp, cusp, and cusp. We've got deep grooves. Very definite anatomy, primary anatomy. The second of the class type has shallower grooves. It's a little more wrinkled. And remember that fourth cusp, that distal lingual cusp, is sometimes, it's oftentimes smaller and sometimes even missing.
Misty, is that oblique ridge on the, okay, yeah. Thank you.
Oblique and transverse. So this is more of a simplistic drawing. I'll take this as well. Okay, the first and second molars have buccal lingual that's greater than the mesial distal dimension. So it's what they're talking about, it has a buccal lingual dimension. That's greater than the mesial distal. Buccal lingual is greater than the mesial distal. The first molars, the buccal half is often narrower mesiodistally than the lingual half because of that large distal lingual cusp. So this is different from what the general characteristics are. Remember, the general characteristic is that the teeth are generally narrower on the lingual. It's not on the first molar, but it is on the second molar. It's rhomboid or almost square outline, acute angles, and it's got that cusp of Carabelli. This is showing you the oblique ridge. Second molars vary a little bit more than the first molars. The distal lingual cusp is oftentimes smaller than it is on the first molar. Sometimes it's even missing. So it's really a more of a heart-shaped tooth. So for the first molar, you've got a very distinct distal lingual cusp. On the second molar, not so much. It's smaller. Second molars, the distal lingual cusp is oftentimes quite small. So the lingual half is narrower as it is in most teeth. So this is the second molar versus the first molar. The lingual half is larger. The distal lingual cusp on the first molar is distinct and large. It's less distinct and smaller on the second molar. Now, your national boards are always going to have, they always like these questions, are going to have a picture of an outline, and they're going to ask you, what tooth is this? And it's always a molar. And it's an occlusal pattern. So this is an important slide to flag for when you're reviewing for your boards as well as my tests. Pentagon, 5 sides, is a mandibular first molar. Rectangular is a mandibular second molar. Rhomboid or parallelogram is the maxillary first or second molar. And heart shape is the maxillary second three-cusp type, or a third maxillary third molar. This is the heart shape because it doesn't have that distal lingual cusp. This is the distal lingual on the first molar. Doesn't have one here on the second molar. If it did, it would be smaller. And then these, you're going to be able to tell are mandibular molars when we get in that, because this is 1 cusp, 2 cusp, 3 cusps versus a second molar. Okay, is more rectangular. So this will make sense. Right now it doesn't.
Misty, on the slide before, this third picture, it says maxillary right second molar, but you said it's going to be first molar.
This is, this one here is the occlusal of the maxillary. This one here.
Yes, yes.
Okay, it is a rhomboid shaped tooth, and this is a second molar when compared to a first molar, just because the anatomy is a little more shallower, but you have to compare this to a first molar to really know it's a second molar.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's hard to tell just by looking at it. You don't see a cusp of Carabelli, which is one of those identifying marks you'd be looking at for a first molar. And look at this groove here. This groove should be going all the way down, because is it the buccal or the lingual that's more caries prone on a maxillary molar?
Lingual.
The lingual. Very good, Jonathan. Okay, so now we can compare. The picture's a little fuzzy, but the second molar has 3 larger cusps, and that distal lingual cusp is small compared to the first molar. The occlusal pattern is much shallower on the second molar than it is on the first molar. So when you are calling out hard tissue to the dentist and you have a suspicious area on the occlusal of number 3, which is your first molar, where is it? Is it the mesial occlusal pit? Is it the central pit? Or is it the distal lingual? So can you see how you have to be very exacting in your language? It's not just an occlusal, suspicious area, where on the occlusal? Cusp of Carabelli is present on 70% of the first molars, and the size of it varies greatly. All right, so this is a huge cusp of Carabelli versus this is just, you can't even really see it. You've got very definite occlusal pattern, and look at this distal lingual groove goes over onto the lingual surface. Look at the difference in the definition of the occlusal patterns. Again, it's much easier to compare a first and second versus determining which one's the first or second. That cusp of Carabelli is the identifying characteristic.
Okay, so Miss D, so if on the clinical exam you're gonna show 2 different tools to identify, or just give it 1 tooth to?
Well, if I give 1 tooth and it's a first molar, I will tell you that I will guarantee it'll have a cusp of Carabelli on it.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay, but don't let the cusp of Carabelli be the only thing you're looking at. Guess what? This is a first molar with a cusp of Carabelli and a second molar with a cusp of Carabelli.
Exactly.
Right? But you can see, look at the difference of this distal lingual, okay? And that these distal cusp is much smaller when compared to the first molar. This is from a different textbook, but you've usually got 4 cusps on a first molar, not including the cusp of Carabelli, but this is to illustrate what your drawing should have. You've got an oblique ridge here and a transverse ridge here. Remember, 2 triangular ridges that go from the buccal to the lingual is a transverse ridge. This is an oblique ridge because it goes from the distobuccal to the mesial-lingual. And a transverse ridge is typically indicative of a maxillary molar. Mandibular molars don't have oblique ridges. That's what you want to look for, is an oblique ridge. This is another picture of a first molar. This is an outline of what we call the occlusal table. And this is your marginal ridge here, your distal marginal ridge and your mesial marginal ridge. But look, it's got 3 distinct pits from the fossa. Central groove from the mesial to the central fossa. You've got a buccal groove, a distal oblique, okay, and a transverse groove. Oblique, transverse. If no transverse groove is there of the oblique ridge, okay, now look at this. The occlusal caries and preparations may not cross the oblique ridge. Okay, so what this is saying is when a tooth has a cavity in it, what the dentists have to do is they will prepare each pit separately. They're not going to make this into one big cavity prep because this is that transverse ridge and they don't interrupt the transverse ridge. So when you're doing sealants, you will do a sealant here and you'll do a sealant here and hopefully carry it over to the lingual. When the dentist is doing an occlusal, they'll count this usually as one filling and two fillings, two separate occlusal fillings. You get to charge them twice. Now remember that not all maxillary molars have that distal lingual cusp, and that is the heart-shaped. And this is the tooth that I either see pentagon shape or heart shape on the board exams that are released. Heart shape is a maxillary second or third molar. It's the second molar. They usually won't give you the choice of both, maxillary second or maxillary third. You'll have one or the others because it doesn't have that distal lingual cusp. Three-cusp type. We know that this is the mesial. This is the distal. And then this is the lingual. Contacts. Mesial and distal contacts are located buccal to the buccal lingual center. So the buccal lingual center is going to be here. The contact areas are more buccal. Okay. And that's nothing new. So I want to know what is number one. If you had to label this.
A contact point?
The contact point would be here.
Longer distal, oh, longer
It's
cusp,
asking what this is right here.
bigger cusp.
Okay, so when you're
Would it be the buccal marginal ridge, mesial marginal ridge?
there you go. It's the mesial-buccal cusp. This is the mesial-buccal cusp ridge of the mesial-buccal cusp.
Yeah.
Number 4 is the distobuccal cusp ridge of the distobuccal cusp. So this again is knowing what the language is. Your board exams are not going to be asking you these type of specific questions. It's going to be wanting to know what the oblique ridge is versus a transverse ridge if it asks, or it's going to be asking you about a cusp of Carabelli or this distal lingual. So those are the big things there. Marginal ridge, 10 is the mesial marginal ridge. 5 is the distal marginal ridge. Now for the third molars, anything goes for third molars. You are going to draw your third molars. The roots are closer together, oftentimes fused. If there is a tilt to the roots, they're going to tilt towards the distal. Maxillary molars are the only teeth to occlude with only one tooth. This is usually a test question, my friends. The maxillary molars are the only maxillary teeth to occlude with only one tooth. Third molars are oftentimes smaller than the first or second. There's something called an operculum, which is that tissue that covers an impacted or an erupting tooth. If it becomes infected, that operculum becomes infected, it's called pericoronitis. This is the operculum. Think about all the bacteria and food that can get smashed in there. That's going to be infected eventually. Third molars are generally smaller. They're more bulbous. I'm sorry, what? Okay. They're more wrinkled. Okay. They've got more secondary and tertiary anatomy. So they're more wrinkled. They don't have that primary anatomy. The roots are often fused. They have a long trunk and the roots are thin, pointed, and if bent, they bend distally. The size varies greatly. Usually third molars are the shortest of the permanent teeth because of a short crown and a short root. These are maxillary third molars. They really look different. You've got a little microdont here versus this looks like, you know, gemination, fusion. Look how large this one is. Variation of shapes. Okay, everything you wanted to know about maxillary molars. Any questions on that?
Misty, I have a quick question just about the drawings. The more we progress with the drawings, just FYI, not that my drawings were great with shading at all,